Hey there, Timberwolves. Miss Robolino coming in with a review session for you about the Texas Revolution. So I just wanted to quickly go ahead and explain what is going on over here in the Texas Revolution. So a quick recall of Texas history is, Americans are invited into Texas by the Spanish government, but eventually because of the Mexican Revolution, Mexico takes control and then they restate these impresario systems in 1821. And it basically requires people coming in to become Mexican citizens, which require them to speak Spanish, follow Mexican laws, and follow that culture. Many impresarios agree to this, but they don't really practice this correctly. So by 1830, Americans outnumber the native Mexicans inside of Texas, and this starts to raise alarm inside the Mexican government, specifically after events that we learned about in the road to revolution. Disagreements do arise, and one of those big disagreements is slavery, where it's illegal in Texas, but it's allowed in where it's illegal in Mexico, but allowed in Texas because the Mexican government allowed Texans to kind of create their own laws. So one of the major causes of the revolution inside of Texas between Mexico and Texas was negligence. Mexico allowed Anglos to run their own affairs in government, which obviously allowed them to have slavery be legalized and used for their cotton plantations. And there was also cultural differences. Mexicans were Christians practicing Catholicism. They spoke Spanish, whereas the Anglos refused to learn and assimilate to Mexican culture, which caused a lot of confrontation and leads up to the tension inside there. So this is kind of what we're starting to see, and we will explain a little later. So Mexicans' response to Americans inside of Texas not really following leads to this law, the law of April 6, 1830, to stop Anglos from immigrating to Texas, which obviously gets many Texans very, very upset and call to arms, for this fight for their rights inside the Constitution of 1824, which is the Constitution of Mexico, modeled after the U.S. Constitution. So at this time, slavery in Mexico is outlawed in 1830s, but Anglos continue to ignore what's going on because these impresarios and these colonies kind of run their colonies the way that they want, and Mexico just ignores it. The governments inside there, the Anglos believe they have state rights, very similar to in American Constitution and American society. So they feel that Mexico is taking over those rights because Santa Anna starts to take more control over Texas and their rights and takes those rights away, which is really what starts this revolution inside of Texas against Mexico, because their rights as colonies in Texas were being taken away. To basically recap, the road to revolution does go in this order. So you have the Freudian Rebellion, which is Hayden Edwards charging new titles to people who cannot prove they purchased, gets everyone upset, and the Mexican government decides to revoke his contract and send him away. He responds back with taking over a fort inside of Nacogdoches and has to be taken down with the militia created by Stephen F. Austin. Because this brings more notice into Texas, we start to see that Mexico wants to pay attention to what's going on. They see that Texas is causing trouble and they want to go investigate. So they send Manuel Mieri-Terán, and he is a general in the Texas Army, and he goes to Texas. And on his way to Texas, he writes a report. And the report basically says that Texas is mainly American. The U.S. Texans, or the Texans that come from the U.S., outnumber the Tejanos, or the people of Mexico, and that they are practicing their own schools and they are practicing their own religion and they're speaking English and they're not assimilating to Mexican culture, which goes against their contracts. He fears that if Mexican government does not intervene, Texas will become part of the U.S. territory, and he urges the government to react. And so they do this with the law of April 6, 1830, and this basically stops slavery in Texas. It no more immigration from the United States. They stop new impresario contracts, and they start taxing U.S. goods. This obviously gets everyone very upset because they found this law to be very unconstitutional because it went against state rights. Again, remember, many people inside of Texas are U.S. citizens. They are big believers in these state rights, and these laws shouldn't be forced upon them because it goes against the federal government where they share the power. From there, the conflict of Anilac is started with all these rebellions start to erupt all over Texas because of these new laws. And one of those was at Anilac, where one of the generals arrests 2 Texans without probable cause, and that is William Travis and Patrick Henry. And they are basically imprisoned, and many people start to rebel about this, and they basically ask for their release. The general says he'll do it, but then he rescinds his decision. Rescind means takes back. So he takes back his decision to let them go, and this starts a whole lot of issues. So now the people of Texas feel like they have to rebel, and they feel like they need to get violent to rebel. So half of these people feel they need to take a radical stance, and they go to grab this cannon to basically go and release their fellow Texan citizens from Anilac. Whereas the other half seems to be a little bit more civil, like Stephen F. Austin, and they come together at Turtle Bayou and they write this resolution, and they send it to the newly elected president, Santa Anna, who was elected in basically 1834 in the beginning, and 1833. And they basically sent him this letter stating their loyalty and allegiance to Mexico, and they are not rebelling against Mexico, trying to start a revolution. They are just rebelling against what has happened at Anilac, and that their constitutional rights of the 1824 Constitution are being withheld, and that they have a right to do what they're doing. And they are doing this out of anger with what's happening with the law of April 6, 1830, and the arresting of Texans without probable cause. So this eventually leads to the Battle of Velasco, which is a battle that really didn't need to happen. It's just tension building up between the Mexican soldiers and the Texans decide to respond with these tensions with a cannon shot through one of the forts, killing Mexican soldiers. And this really leaves a bad taste inside of the Mexican government's mouth about, Texas and these American impresarios. So with that being said, Stephen Austin decides to hold this convention, the Convention of 1833, where he gets the leaders of the impresarios and decides to meet together to discuss what they're going to do. So at this time, they decide to take a look at what's happening, and they demand to become, their own state. And they feel that if they were their own state and separated from Coluya, because at this time, Texas is Coluya y Texas, and they write some other grievances as well. And these grievances are basically, they want to allow U.S. immigration, they want to stop these taxes, and they want to bring back slavery into these colonies. And they write this letter, and they nominate Stephen F. Austin to go down to Mexico City and present this to the new president, Santa Anna. Of course, Santa Anna rides down. He meets with Santa Anna, who agrees to these terms, except for the separation of Coluya y Texas. They have to stay the same. Stephen accepts, but he sent a letter to, he basically sent a letter back to San Antonio saying they need to create a provisional government because Santa Anna didn't meet with him for 2 months and he wasn't sure what was going on. So the Mexican officials arrest him on the way back to Texas and find him as a act of treason, do not give him a proper trial, and he ends up being in jail for like 2 years. And this obviously is the final straw with Texans. They get upset and they're done with Mexico, and they feel it's now time to take action because now this government has turned to this centralist government, which means Santa Anna is the center of control and he's taking away the rights of these people. And that really leads to the beginning of the Texas Revolution with the Battle of Gonzales. The Texas Revolution starts in 1835 over Santa Anna trying to get back this cannon in, one of the colonies, specifically Dewitt's. And it really starts this big battle where, they take this cannon and they use it against the Mexican army who was sent to collect this cannon. So the Anglos believe that they are rebelling against an oppressive government, and they feel they have the right to do that because of the Constitution of 1824 based off the United States Constitution. So Santa Anna at this time, he is president and he seeks to put down the Texas Revolution and gain power over Mexico. And he decides to do this at the Battle of the Alamo, where many Texans have come together to basically use it as a, spy, operation. And the purpose of this point of the Alamo was to completely show the Texans his power. And it ends up doing the complete opposite. And if we just take a look at the Alamo, we see that, there were about 200 men defending the Alamo. It was very large, too big, and there weren't enough men to defend. The forces led by this Alamo was William Travis and Jim Bowie. So close to 200 Texans are over here in Tejanos to fight the Mexican army, which numbers about 2,000. The Mexican army creates a siege around the Alamo, stopping things coming in, things coming out, and eventually the Mexican army storms in and executes everybody. So all Texans are killed, and the Alamo becomes a symbol of heroism and rallies Texans to fight. And this is basically one of those things that happen. At this time, we start to see that there is a convention going on, which is the Convention of 1836, up north by Washington and Brazos. And this is where a convention happens with many Americans and some Texans, specifically Sam Houston. And they meet to write this Declaration of Independence, stating their independence from Mexico. And they create this document. And basically on March 2nd, around the same time as the Alamo or after the Alamo siege, they claim their independence. The Republic of Texas is created, and Sam Houston is named head of the Texas Army at this time. Stephen F. Austin went to the U.S. to seek money and troops and to go ahead and make sure that this was funded. So the Battle of Goliad happens just a few months after, and this is just another huge massacre. So James Fannin is in command of his troops. He tried to go help the Alamo before it happened. Unfortunately, he ends up, not able to go because of situations going on. A wagon breaks down, oxen are away, and the men are just completely not prepared. Some don't have shoes. There's not a lot of supplies, so they basically stay. They try to leave before they get into confrontation with the Mexican army, but he basically waits way too long. All his troops are surrounded in a field by the Mexicans, and they surrender, and they go back to Goliad. From there, the General Urrea asks what to do, and Santa Anna replies with execute them all. He obviously was unhappy about this. If you remember from the reading, he was completely against it, but he had to follow his orders from his commander-in-chief, which was Santa Anna. They surrender and they march everyone out into a field, and they basically execute them all. Going back to Goliad, where it was used as an infirmary. An infirmary is where sick people go, or wounded people, and they execute everyone. Fannin being the last to be executed, so he has to watch all his men die, and then he dies last. And this again is a huge massacre similar to Alamo, where it just makes everyone so angry in Texas, and it basically gives them this cry to join the fight and win independence from Santa Anna and Mexico. So Sam Houston at this time, who makes Texas his home, is the commander of the Texan Army, who overtakes Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, gives Texas independence from Mexico. And that leads us to the last battle. So San Jacinto, what happened on April 21st, 1836, Palm Sunday. So on April 21st, 1836 forces, I'm sorry, after Palm Sunday, led by Houston, defeated Santa Anna with a surprise attack. Santa Anna was basically, getting his army ready to go ahead and continue on with taking over Texas because of the wins at the Alamo and Goliad. But he doesn't really prepare really well. And Sam Houston turns his army around to head towards San Jacinto because one of the scouts saw that they were coming, and where they are by Buffalo Bayou was a great place for the Texans to hide inside the brush and the trees. So they basically go in and they surprise attack them with a battle that's 18 minutes long. And they continue slaughtering. 630 Mexicans are killed. Only 9 Texans die that day. And at this time, what drove these men to be very driven at this point was they were screaming for the revenge of Alamo and Goliad. So Sam Houston used that. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, remember your fallen soldiers. And they were just driven and pumped, and they went into the camp and just basically chaos broke out, and it caught off the Mexican army off guard and allowed them for a victory where they found Santa Anna. And you can just see the chaos going on over here. They find Santa Anna in masquerading as a soldier, and they bring him back to Sam Houston, where he is forced to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Velasco. Treaty gives Texas its independence. Also, boundary between Mexico and Texas is established. Texas argues the Rio Grande is boundary, but Mexico argues that it is the Nueces River. And this will come back and haunt both countries later, and we'll learn that in the Republic of Texas. And so at this point, Texas now becomes its own republic. And from there, the government with the people elect representatives to govern them. And who else to model their constitution than the United States? If you remember the Convention of 1836, where many Americans were attending, they basically set up a constitution just like the United States. They have a Bill of Rights, and everything matches to a T. So they decide to elect Sam Houston as their president. Stephen Austin becomes the Secretary of State, but sadly dies a couple of months into office from pneumonia. Texas officers, they basically offer new settler grants to come into the southern states and bring enslaved Africans with them, which basically starts a brand new republic in Texas. So that is the review that I have for you today. I really hope that this encourages you to go over your notes and make sure that you are familiar with what you need to do. And I will see you all tomorrow. Good luck. Happy studying.